From Illinois Public Media, this is the 21st Show. I'm Brian Mackey. The Illinois Department of Early Childhood officially launched its operations at the start of July. Its responsibilities range from handling the Child Care Assistance Program for families to licensing child care facilities. Governor J.B. Pritzker called for the creation of the new agency 3 years ago. At the time, 3 different departments handled what's now the work of one agency. The past couple of years have been spent hiring and organizing ahead of this month's launch. Overseeing all of that has been the new departmental secretary, Teresa Ramos. She grew up in Chicago and went on to earn 3 degrees from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, including a PhD in anthropology with a minor in Latino studies. She has served in leadership roles at education nonprofits Illinois Action for Children and Advance Illinois. Before becoming secretary of the Department of Early Childhood, she was in Governor Pritzker's cabinet as the first assistant deputy governor for education. Teresa Ramos joins us now. Secretary Ramos, welcome to the 21st Show.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate being here.
And listeners, I should say, we are live for the first half of today's show with Secretary Ramos. If you or someone in your circle has tried to get childcare recently, what has been your experience? And what questions do you have for the leader of this new department? You can join the conversation by giving us a call at 800-222-9455. That's 800-222-9455. All right, Secretary Ramos, can you say more than I did in the introduction about what this department handles, both on the family side and for providers?
Sure. And I'm thrilled to be here today. All early childhood childcare services are under one roof at the new department. So as you mentioned, childcare and financial assistance for childcare, supporting early intervention services for children and families with disabilities and developmental delays, home visiting, really the whole kit and caboodle of what it takes to support families prenatal through those early years now sits at one agency. We've
All right. I think we may have a little issue with our connection there with Secretary Ramos. So we're going to work on bringing that back. Let me remind listeners, this is the 21st Show, and we were speaking with Teresa Ramos, who is the Secretary of the Illinois Department of Early Childhood, which is a new agency. She was the former first assistant deputy governor for education under Governor J.B. Pritzker. And Secretary Ramos, I think we have our connection restored now. So you were telling us, what the agency does, and maybe we'll just sort of direct this a little bit and say, how much of what the department is doing is new work as opposed to jobs that, used to be handled by other departments.
Appreciate the question. A big part of the new work at the department is making sure that our programs and services for families with young children work well together. That means we understand what's happening from a family's perspective or a provider's perspective. Our marching orders really are to make the early childhood services simpler for families to access so that today you can call over to the new department and get an answer to your question rather than having to go to 3 different websites, call a different person for every program. Now we are combining, merging, and aligning our programs to simplify that experience, making it easier for families and providers to navigate access to services and supports.
So I mentioned this has been a multi-year process to get the department up and running. What have you been doing with that time?
Appreciate that. We're in the middle of starting up an agency that has lots of rules. Unlike maybe startups outside of state government, there are lots of rules around how you start up an agency. So we've had to build a whole HR team and a whole legal team, all of the operations functions that allows us to drive equity and efficiency in delivering services. One of the things I'm especially excited about is really having our data organized in a way that can tell policymakers, can tell, anyone who wants to look how is the state doing at serving families in childcare programs or early intervention programs or in preschool programs. So we started really working on that work a number of years ago to get us to a more transparent system for explaining what's happening in those early years for families with young children in Illinois.
So you touched on this a little bit, but maybe you can expound. The term childcare, early childhood, this encompasses a lot of different ideas, different forms. So talk about, what some of those forms are in terms
I
of, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. It is so true. I think that is a big part of the complexity is someone says childcare means something very technical, and other folks know that they're meaning childcare to mean who is caring for their child. And a lot of what we've been doing is reconciling the complexity in what has been decades of programs and investments in the state. Sometimes that term has meant the same thing, sometimes it hasn't. Here I mean it in two ways. One, the most general sense for parents and providers who is caring for your children, who is approved by this, licensed and approved by the state to care for your child as early as 6 weeks until they're in school. But we also have programs that support what is the high cost of care nationally, which is the Child Care Assistance Program. And that is a financial assistance program for parents to support care in any of those settings. It can be homes, it can be child care centers, it can be in school districts even. And so when I think about childcare in that terminology in the broadest sense, it means who is caring for your child when you're not able to care for them, and how we license and support those providers to do it in a safe, high quality way.
What do we know? What evidence do we have about how important, this sort of stage of life, this sort of care is developmentally for young children?
Oh my gosh. We have so much evidence, and Illinois is really a wealth of resources. Our advocacy, our research partners in early childhood education, we know more about brain development now than we have in the last 40 years, and it continues to grow. 90% of a child's brain, of a human's brain, develops before the age of 5. Really, we are forming those early connections in our brain that help us achieve and be successful every year after those early childhood years. And so it's so incredibly important that children are safe and in loving environments, and that we are supporting them with the kind of engagement that will lead them to success, whatever they choose to do in school and after.
Talk about your approach to leadership, to running this department. How have you thought about that?
I appreciate the question on my approach to running the department. Really has been, we have to do this work together across the rich diversity of the state. And so there's really not an average family in Illinois. There's a rich diversity of families across the state, within Chicago, within central and southern Illinois, and we need to engage those families and understand what's working, what's not working, and build an agency that has the infrastructure to listen, to take that information and adjust our program. So that way, if you're a family living in a rural community and you need an EI therapy, you need speech therapy, we have a way for you to get those services that you need. Same thing is true in Chicago. We want to make sure we understand what a family on the north side versus the west side might need to have the services that supports that brain development. So my leadership style, the agency is built on making sure that we understand and have the infrastructure to understand what's happening in those earliest years of life, how our services are doing, and we take the good, the bad, and sometimes ugly, and use that to improve our practice.
Let me say this is the 21st show. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Teresa Ramos, who is the new secretary of the Illinois, well, I shouldn't say new. She's the secretary of the new Illinois Department of Early Childhood, which officially launched at the start of the month after a multi-year process of ramping up. Previously, she was the first assistant deputy governor for education under Governor J.B. Pritzker. If you want to join us, 800-222-9455. 800-222-9455. So I was looking over the department's website, and there's a page on mission and values and vision, and I noticed, words like equitable, equity, um, and excellence, not efficiency. Talk about how you're approaching that, because I'm sure there are going to be questions you will be getting or have gotten in the General Assembly about how taxpayer money is spent. How are you thinking about efficiency here?
Brian, really appreciate the question. And I have gotten this in the General Assembly already, in our uh, subject matter hearings. So for me, efficiency partly has to be defined by programs that work. And so I typically talk about this as we need equity, we need efficiency, and we need efficacy. If our programs aren't working to serve the diversity of families across the state, then we won't have efficiency. Equity really is about getting families with young children the services that they need to survive. And when we do that in those early years, when we have a strong system of early intervention services that support a child who needs speech therapy, that development, we see we can see less reliance on early childhood special education services or special education services in K-12. So we know the investments in these first 5 years help build efficiency for the whole education system from, prenatal to and through post-secondary. But also, we know that equity is ensuring that folks have access to these services, and that access makes those services efficient and ultimately effective. So we know it's almost three sides of the triangle here: equity, efficiency, and efficacy.
All right, let's talk about some recent developments in the world of childcare and state government. This summer, Governor Pritzker signed legislation, or now a law, to make changes to childcare licensing in Illinois. What's the idea behind that?
I really appreciate this has been one of our priorities for the last several years. We know right now our childcare licensing system is complex. It is built on antiquated technology. We are still using paper, pencil, postage stamp, fax machine to get information in, and the statute and rule are very complicated. We took one of the first steps to start to simplify that process this year with the General Assembly, saying we really need to streamline and ease the licensing process and modernize some of our terminology. Back to your first question, Brian, what is childcare? How do we move away from talking about daycare to childcare? Because what we've heard from providers is they're not caring for days, they're caring for children, and they want the language that we use to recognize them as the professionals that they are. So really the first piece of legislation helped us clarify and simplify some of the language. It helped us simplify some of the process. It will take many more steps to get us to a simpler licensing system that allows for childcare providers across the state, whether they're in home or a center, to start up and run an effective licensing business that keeps children safe and supports them in those earliest years of brain development.
There was also an increase in funding for the Child Care Assistance Program, which you mentioned this earlier. It serves lower income families. Maybe talk a little bit more about the eligibility criteria and who that program is for.
The Child Care Assistance Program really is for families who are struggling to pay for childcare, especially new families that have infants and toddlers. The care can be very expensive, in part because we know we need smaller ratios of children to adults to serve our youngest babies in the state. The $55 million increase in CCAP funding was to allow us to serve up to 155,000 children in Illinois, really record numbers of children who can be supported by CCAP enrollment. It is to maintain that eligibility for 100 up to 155,000 children. It really supports children and families so that families can go to work and providers can provide them with affordable care.
There's been a lot of attention politically, especially at the national level, on, who deserves this sort of assistance, you might say. And I know some people object to using that term. You can take that on if you want. But, how do you make sure this care gets to those who actually need it most?
It's a great question. And I think what we all can agree to in the science is there is how important those early investments are to a child's brain that helps them make good decisions, have that executive functioning we like to call in the early childhood, that executive functioning that supports them making good decisions for the rest of their life. So really, in my mind, there's no more important investment and then in these early years where we can set up children to be successful and productive for the rest of their lives. In fact, there's a lot of research that talks about how Gene Heckman, from professor from the University of Chicago, a behavioral economist, says, we have for every dollar we invest in early childhood, there's actually a 13% return on that investment over time. So wherever we put those dollars, it does support not only a family in those most critical years, the child's outcome, but it's a good investment for the state overall. And we think children, right? Children don't choose where they're born. We know how important they are to
Right.
support them and provide them with care from those earliest days of life.
All right, we are going to continue with Teresa Ramos, Secretary of the Illinois Department of Early Childhood. But first, we need to take a break. If you want to join us, 800 222 9455. More from this conversation after a moment. This is The 21st Show. It's the 21st Show. I'm Brian Mackey. We are talking today with Teresa Ramos, Secretary of the new Illinois Department of Early Childhood. Officially, it launched at the start of this month after a multi-year ramp-up. She was previously First Assistant Deputy Governor for Education under Governor Pritzker and has previous roles in education nonprofits, Illinois Action for Children, and Advance Illinois. She's also a PhD anthropologist from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and grew up in Chicago. If you want to join us today, 800-222-9455 is the number, 800-222-9455. All right, Secretary Ramos, on a personal note, I was thinking about, as we were preparing for this, my kids are now old enough that they're not, in childcare anymore, but the places they went a decade ago, one of them is now an empty building, and the other one is no longer would have been eligible for our family. They limited their eligibility because of the high demand from their core, population. And, this is a story that you hear all the time, right? Childcare shortage. There's a lack of staffing, a lack of options. Parents find themselves on years-long wait lists to get into daycares. What can your department do to deal with those realities for parents?
Hi, Brian. Really appreciate the question about how do we start to tackle the shortage in care options across the state for families who want and need childcare. I think that is a big part of our mission. The first thing that we did as the governor announced this transition is said, you know what, we need really good data to understand what's happening. To exactly your point, we have a lot of anecdotal stories from across the state about what's happening in community, and we need to really understand how are we seeing new providers come into the system? How are we seeing them exit the system? How does licensing complexity add to that process? Are they accessing providers accessing all of the state subsidies? Those are questions where we need a strong data infrastructure to help us answer. And when the three programs or major programs lived across three agencies, and they came together because, a federal opportunity or an act of the General Assembly, not all the data talk to each other. And I would be in the governor's office saying, can we make this data talk to each other? And it just didn't. There were different definitions of, provider or eligibility or access. We've been working for a couple of years to make sure that we can all align on how we talk about childcare, what we meant when we define it, so we have better data to inform what is happening in Champaign County around, childcare providers who are aspiring or childcare providers who um, are telling us they're about to shut down. What do we see happening? How do we support them? That first step is, I think, getting better access to data and then hearing from the field, which we've been doing for 2 years. We've put up many modalities for listening to providers and parents about what's working. We know it is too complex, and the way that we've operated with across 3 agencies has meant that providers, a childcare, business owner, provider has to navigate that complexity, has to call somebody at the agency for a different agency for each thing that they need to do. Taking it all under one roof allows us to simplify that process over time, making it easier for providers to serve the families and children, spending less time on that administrative back office function. And there's more work for us to do that requires both us to invest in our operational infrastructure, our data infrastructure, but then to think about what do we need from, partnerships with the General Assembly to align on easing the funding mechanism, simplifying some of those things that it requires an act of the General Assembly to help us do.
What about getting more people into the workforce, right? I mean, it's cliche to say parents would do anything for their children, and yet being a childcare worker is a pretty low paying, frankly, low status job in our society. How do you think about that?
It is a low paying job that requires a lot of credentials because, as you know, right, thinking about where you're going to leave your young child while you're going to work is a big deal. We're entrusting uh, a whole another group of adults to care for our children in the way that we would, and we've learned so much about brain development and how much children learn in those first 5 years. We require early childhood teachers and educators to have credentials in order to do this work well. And so it is a low pay but high credentialed system that we continue to need to support. Everything I said about providers is true for the workforce. Right now, we make it really complex for them to find where they have, scholarships or access to credentials or supports. And we intend to start to simplify and make those access points easier. A big one was bringing all of those supports into one agency and making sure that we had one person really focused on workforce supports. So that way we can continue to invest and understand what's required to support them over time.
I know we're coming up on the end of our time together. Two things I want to ask you about. And the first is the Trump administration has attempted to withhold funding from Illinois in many different areas. One of those was $1 billion for childcare. That's billion with a B. How do you make sure people are getting accurate, up to date information about what that does and does not mean?
That's a great question. Prior to July 1st, we were trying to quarterback across 3 agencies communications to make sure that what the state board was saying and what DCFS was saying and what DHS was saying was all aligned. And we now have an amazing communications team that continues to work with all of those agencies, but is the one-stop shop for accurate information for the field. We continue to build and grow how we're communicating, whether that's email or through our relationships across the state. There's a broad statewide infrastructure of family engagement specialists, provider engagement folks to communicate. So we've now become the hub for getting accurate information out so that way they don't learn about what might be happening or might not be happening and how real it is on the news. We're able to digest that and communicate with them.
Last question. If we are talking in a year or 3 years or maybe a successor of yours, even 10 years from now, how will we know whether the department has been successful in reaching its goals?
It's a great question. We've said we want to make sure that Illinois is on a path to be the best state in the nation to raise a family with young children, and that answer, what it takes, is different everywhere. I think we will see in the data that have we done a better job of making it easier to start to be a childcare provider? Do we see an increase in stakeholders engaged in our workforce? Do we see stronger infrastructure across the state meeting the needs of families? And can you see that really in our data? So that's what I think success will look like. Will we see more streamlined modern processes that you're no longer using paper, pencil, postage stamp? You will see really a just a new way of working as we sunset the old ways of doing business as a child care provider in Illinois.
Teresa Ramos is secretary of the Illinois Department of Early Childhood. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.